You have to walk the talk. You have to be authentic as a leader. If you're not doing it, they see that.
It is entirely universal. There's other people who are going through this.
For me, a great leader needs to be able to marry three things: vision, systems, and people.
Welcome to Leadership Moments. If this is your first time, and if you are returning, thank you for your support.
This show is about leaders from all walks of life, leadership tips, and maybe even a little of what you wouldn't expect to help you in leadership.
We would appreciate it if you tell someone else about our podcast as we strive to support all leaders that want to just be better.
Let's get on with the show.
Today, our guest is Garrett Delph. Garrett stands at the forefront of business transformational solutions for the new generation of leaders. He is the founder and chief clarity officer of Clarity Ops LLC. As a serial entrepreneur, he has established a track record of founding 3 successful international businesses that have collectively generated over $50 million in revenue. Garrett's new generational business solutions are created for leaders who need faster, easier, and more profitable step-by-step ways for scaling businesses. Today, we are going to talk about how leaders can identify and find their way out of management vertigo and accountability with themselves and others in a healthy, effective way. Let's jump in. Garrett, I'm so excited to have you on the show today. You have some great experience and knowledge and things that you're doing to help other leaders, and I know our listeners are going to gain a lot of knowledge from it. What I'd like to do is start with a story that you have about a chairman of a board that called you out once, and I'd love for you to share kind of what happened, how you worked through it, and ultimately how it defined who you are today.
Yeah. Thank you, Stacey. By the way, thank you for having me. Really, really excited to be on your show. So back around 2012, a business that I still own, but then was beginning to experience hockey stick growth. We were having, tumultuous times as we scaled, and the chairman of my board came into my office, sat me down, and was visibly kind of angry. And that was weird. And he kind of unloaded on me and said, brass tacks, if you don't stop micromanaging your people, you're going to destroy your business and you're going to harm all of the people as a result. And first of all, that term to me was brand new. I don't think I'd ever heard that term.
Micromanaging, you never heard?
Right.
Wow.
Maybe I was living under a rock. Clearly I was not on LinkedIn. And so I took that to heart. And here's what I learned. I learned that I was micromanaging. And I learned that unbeknownst to me, people hated it. And there was a growing grudge in our culture as a result. And I was teaching my leaders to do the same. And ultimately, in digging into the root, I found that the reason I was micromanaging is because I didn't have control. I didn't have leverage and levers in the business to ensure by design it went the direction that I wanted it to go, that I wanted my leaders to take it. And ultimately, I found that when I don't have control, I grasp and fret and control in a negative way. And so that led me on a path to figure out, okay, why don't I have control of my business, and what do I need to build to make sure I do have control? It reminds me of that old adage, if you don't know where you're going, you won't know when you get there. And I feel like if you don't have governance in your business, then you cannot control its direction. And so that led me on a lifetime pursuit of creating clarity in business, which is rooted in, governance. And so that people who lead a business can direct it with strength and with clarity. And then all of the benefits, which, maybe is for another show, all of the benefits that come with that approach. And that was many tough learning lessons, but that one was definitely top 3.
Yeah, I love that. And so, since that was new to you when you heard it, just to make sure our listeners understand, why don't you define micromanaging first? Let's start there.
Yeah, as a guy who is a dad of 4 kids, it reminds me of being a helicopter parent. When you're constantly hovering over your kids and you're in their minutia and their details and never giving them permission to kind of flex and be their own and make their own decisions, Yeah. In business, I think it's you're constantly inside of people's personal business space and never giving them autonomy. Literally the opposite of control, I think, is delegated decisions rights. So because I never knew at the time how to empower people with architecture of, a decisions matrix, this is your job. These are the areas that you're responsible for, and here's the outcome we're looking for. Because I didn't do any of that, I was constantly going, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Where are you going here? How come you didn't do this thing? What's wrong with this? How come, where's that? Yeah. Always in everybody's business. And it's a horrible way to live. And it's a horrible way to run a business, by the way.
Yeah.
So that would be my sort of, definition of micromanagement.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And I might be accused of being a helicopter mother at times in my life too. So. Although I try not to, I'm sure I have.
Yeah. Kids might be a little different than employees, but I think the metaphor still stands.
Yeah. So what I think is interesting is when you mentioned it was because you didn't have control. When a lot of people look at micromanagers, they look at them as because they want that control and they over control. So maybe talk a little bit about that difference of, and you started just a few minutes ago, but I'd like to dig a little deeper of what does it look like to have a proper amount of control, maybe?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the calibration there because we know that there are leaders who are control freaks. Like that's where they get their pleasure, which is demented. And it's harmful. We know that. But, just having built a few businesses and being an operational partner to many businesses, I have seen that's the smaller percentage. I think that in general, mostly you don't have organizations that are clear about how to govern their business, and then simultaneously they have a bunch of micromanagers. Typically, that's not the case. So I'd say it's probably more like an 80-20. You have 20% of leaders that are control freaks, and the other 80 just don't have clarity in the business, and they don't have architected governance to let governance control the business, not the manager control the people in the business. And so I think the other part of your question was, forgive me, Stacy, what does leadership look like when it's managing in a healthy way?
Yeah, the proper amount of control. Mm-hmm, exactly.
The proper amount of control. I love it. I would call it accountability. I think that's the right term, and accountability, an example of accountability would be if you have a predefined KPI, a key performance indicator for some sort of output, and the manager sees that perhaps there is a lull in performance or performance that's not meeting the KPI, I would contend a professional manager would go to that teammate and say, hey, here's our KPI. Looks like we're falling short. And by the way, the thing I love about governance is the manager gets to point at the KPI, not at the person. Right? So they point at the KPI and say, hey, looks like we're missing this. What do you think? Why do you think it's happening? Did I misread it? Let's talk about it. And if the consensus is, yes, we're not hitting the KPI, okay, great. What do we need to do to change to hit it? And how can I support you in that effort? I think that is proper control and proper accountability.
I love that example for so many reasons. And because usually it's not the person that fails, it is the process that's failing the person. And you taking the example of the KPI and saying, hey, what's going on here, right? And asking the questions, not accusing, not pointing the finger at the person, understanding, okay, here's our process. We know we try to hit this KPI. We're not hitting it. What's going on, right? And try to understand. So many great nuggets in just that example alone, for sure.
I love that. I've heard this little axiom along the way, which was, if performance is not hitting its mark, there's a very good chance there's a problem with process. And what managers often do is they accuse the person that's performing, and they don't stop and go, maybe there's something broken with the process that the business was responsible to build, not the performer, right? And they go straight to the performer. And so, going back to the chairman on my board, he taught me so many great things. We worked together for 10 years. And one of the things he taught me was to be a Socratic leader. Begin with questions. And he said, if you're at the top, always assume going in, always start with you. Maybe it's you. Always start with you first, And I love that. And what I've seen over the years is mostly, the business failed to provide process to the performer. And so the performer fell short. And what the performer needed was just the right process to hit the target. Big learning curve. I think it applies to most businesses on the planet, that concept.
Yeah. And as an executive coach, that's what I do, is ask a lot of questions. And I teach my clients as leaders that there's times that they need to coach too, which is asking those questions. So those are really good points. And I love the idea of go in with, it could be me. Like, where could I improve? Where could I help this individual succeed? Where could I help that process? Yeah, really great. Really great. Awesome.
Good stuff.
Now, when we were talking earlier, you have a thing called management vertigo. I'd love for you to discuss that a little bit and kind of what you recommend for leaders around it.
Yeah. I love it. So first of all, this came from my own experience. When we talked earlier, we talked about fog. And I often, especially early on in building businesses, felt very foggy and confused and disoriented. And I really began to meditate on that because it was very, very difficult, some difficult times. And that's where I thought, oh my gosh, I have vertigo as a leader. I can't even see straight. And if I have vertigo, I surely will not be able to lead people and guide the business true north. And so it led me on a path to figure out, what does a leader need to get out of the fog, not have vertigo, be clear about their direction. And so, at the end of the day, as I was, processing through that, I thought of AWS. The Amazon Web Services. And I've been drinking their Kool-Aid for a lot of years. But they have a thing called a WAR. And it's I forget what the acronym stands for, but basically it refers to a well-architected framework. And for their businesses, for their customers that are looking to build and grow in the AWS environment, they send in people to their customers and help them architect what they call well-architected frameworks for scale. And I really began to think and meditate on that and apply it to being a leader. And if you're not going to have vertigo, if you're going to be clear about where you're going every month, every quarter, every year, you need a plan. And that plan needs to be well architected. And if you hold fast to that plan and it's rooted in the right sort of recipe, the right formula, it will change your life. It will change your life. That led me on then a path to, again, taking the computer analogy, the tech analogy, to load balance resources in a business. And another thing I've seen in many businesses and in my own is us leaders, we like to hire great people. And when we do, we often incorrectly perceive them as superheroes with super strength and they can do anything. And so we overload them, and we often, expect them without realizing it to play the role of 2, 3, or 4 people. And so I came up with a thing called a quad core management framework. And it came from this whole thing of management vertigo. Is another thing leaders need to do is they need to correctly load balance their people with the proper amount of weight and responsibility, and do not overload them. So, you got strategy, you got managers of people, which is just to maintain and support. You have, if you're a growth-driven company, you probably have constantly new initiatives. So you have project managers, and then you have process managers, typically process builders that deploy that. And so what I found I would do is I would put all 4 of these roles into one superhero. And then what would they end up with? Vertigo. Right? And so, that is sort of my life cycle of, how did I became super foggy. I ended up feeling like I had vertigo. How did I solve it for scale and perpetuity? And that's been my path.
Yeah, I like that term. Can you describe, what does it look like? What does it feel like if you have management vertigo? You gave some examples, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper to help our listeners know so they can do a self-realization. Are they there?
Yeah. Well, I think you feel confused about, I felt very confused about what was most important and what to do. I think that's the brass tacks of it. And could not for the life of me prioritize what was most important. And then that brought a flood of negative emotions and feelings like, am I not good enough? Am I the wrong person? What did I get myself into? What are they going to think of me? How are we going to achieve our vision mission? And it was very, very counterproductive and debilitating to the business and to the people that are being led by leaders, And I think as humans, especially if you're in a leadership position, I'll say it, probably men especially, ego gets in there and you don't want to admit you have a problem and you try to fake it. But that is just a spiral downward, And I think the stats prove it. 9 out of 10 businesses fail. I'm not saying they fail because of management vertigo. There's a lot of other reasons, but I think those are the feelings that at least came up for me, and I tend to perceive that in others that are struggling with it too.
Yeah, thank you, and that helps. And if you think about that list, some people might say, well, that's just prioritization. I just need to prioritize better all these things that are coming at me. Because as we move up in leadership, and if we're at the C level, we will find ourselves with anything and everything coming at us. And I just need to prioritize that. So help our listeners understand what's the difference between prioritization and vertigo, and what you may do different about them.
Right. Well, I love it. And I feel like, C-suite will just say, well, that's just a matter of prioritizing. But I feel like sometimes that's like saying the car won't start. It's just a matter of lifting up the hood and fixing the engine.
Yeah.
It can be that complex. So I think that if a leader, especially in C-suite, is honest enough to admit, okay, I have vertigo and I really cannot get to the root of why I'm so confused. Number one, I would say, stop and get help. Whether that's calling Stacy, whether that's reaching out to the founder or the CEO, maybe that's going to a board member, maybe it's going to a cohort that they can trust and say, I'm all over the place. I need to get sorted. I think that's a really great step because sometimes it's just really tough to get outside of your own head. The next thing I would highly recommend is if you're not clear on what your priorities are, is it possible that's because the leadership above you has not given you clarity and a roadmap about what is expected? That is the other side of the coin, is sometimes even at the C-suite, you are dependent on founders, CEOs, or maybe even a board of directors to be razor sharp clear, and you've forgotten about that. And so you're constantly spinning your wheels because you're missing a roadmap that empowers you to prioritize. And then lastly, perhaps I would say, let's all just remember as leaders, you can't do it all. You can't chase two rabbits. You'll lose them both. And so, probably a good approach is to consider you can probably do less than you really want to, and simplify those priorities so you can harness strength. And then if you end up with extra resources, time, energy, money, then great. Add a few other, blocks to the back of the truck. So those would be 3 points I'd recommend considering.
Great. I think those are great. And now earlier you talked about accountability and how important that is. And I know you do a lot of work around culture and accountability. Maybe what are some tricks or tips that you would give our leaders and listeners around accountability in itself and how to make sure they hold themselves accountable and potentially others?
A quote I heard years ago that just is still with me to this day: you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And so fundamentally, I believe accountability is always rooted in some sort of measurable performance. In business, we all perform. It doesn't matter what you do. If you're a human and you're hired by a company, you're performing something. And I would contend that businesses that win are rooted in measurable performance. And so, whatever that looks like to a business, I would say 2 steps. Number 1, at the core value level, the business should value measuring. Like the business should value measuring, which means that the business expects leaders responsible for output to measure that output. But you have to value it, because if you don't value it, you won't do it. And then the second step is for managers to be clear about what should be measured, and then they should actually measure it. They should actually measure it, and that accountability should go 2 ways. Their leadership should expect them to report what they're measuring, and they should be expected to hold accountable and expect the performer to do what they were hired to do. And I really think it's that simple. Value measuring, measure it, report on the measuring, and expect that the performer do the thing they were hired to do according to the benchmark.
I love that. Love that.
That's
love
a
the
360.
steps.
That's a 360 degree life cycle. It never ends, and it works. It really works, Stacy.
Yeah. I think the hardest part there, I'm guessing, you tell me, would be the follow-up, making sure that you're following those steps in a consistent manner, like saying you do it. Like, I love the simplification of it, but I believe where we fail as leaders is not actually performing all those steps consistently. So what have you seen, or what do you recommend there?
I think you're spot on. I think you're spot on, because I feel like in part we're battling entropy, the law of entropy, that everything wants to move from order to chaos. So that's natural. And then I think the other thing that we battle is the humanity part. Like, even in business, when us humans know we're being paid by a company to do work, I think in general, humans are averse to somebody expecting them to do what they were paid to do. And that's tricky. I think that is the crux of it. But I do think you're right. And that's where I think businesses that win get it right. They're non-negotiable in this area. They're not afraid of hurting people's feelings. And by the way, I want to be careful here. I'm not talking about being a jerk or being disrespectful. I am talking about, high respect, high value org. But recently I was listening to a podcast about Mr. Beast. You've probably heard of him, the most famous YouTuber on the planet. And that guy is, it's from the Founders Podcast, David Senna. I'd highly recommend anybody listening to this podcast go give this episode a listen, because it's just another example of a business owner that's winning, that is razor sharp clear about priorities. And he will not tolerate B or C players. And he defines what A players are. And A players are full of accountability. It's talked about in his this is actually, David talks about Mr. Beast's letter to brand new employees that join the company. And it's really great. And so if we're going to win in business, I think we should 100% build a culture that respects people, that honors them, that empowers them, that lifts them up, that gives them grace, but also expects them to be great performers and deliver what they were hired to do. And I think that's a winning combo.
Yeah, I love that. And when you do that, you're actually showing respect to that individual. One, that you're listening to them, you're inviting them, you're asking them questions, you're helping set them up for success, but also by holding them to that accountability, you're helping them succeed, right? And like, I know I'm better for people that pushed me harder in my life. And those are the people that I know because they respected me, they believed in me. So I think reminding that you're not being a jerk. Like, you can be a jerk with the way you do it. So make sure you do it the right way. But if you really care about that person and you believe in them, you will push them and hold them accountable because you know they can do it. That's why you hired them.
I love it. You're spot on, Stacey. You're spot on. I mean, and what's funny is, again, going back to the stat that 9 in 10 businesses still fail. It's the 10% that get this stuff right. And yet still, it really is a great way to win. But the other 90%, for whatever reason, never have the breakthrough. I was thinking, if we look at professional sports, or professional art, The Last Dance, he talks about how he could not be the amazing player he is today if he did not have coaches that he, by design, made himself accountable to so that he could be the best he could be. Players need great coaches. Great coaches need great boards. I mean, this is just part of winning. And I like your thought too about, like, when we realize these are winning recipes for success, our brain begins to realize, oh my gosh, this actually is the right way. Everybody wins when we get this right, And I think that's a narrative that's missing these days.
I would agree. Yeah, reminding ourselves. Sometimes it's just go, go, go so fast that we don't realize. All of a sudden it's the end of the year and we're like, what did we get done? What was our goals? Why did we try to do this? And how do we help everyone succeed along the way, especially the organization overall? So love that.
Yeah. Or at the end of that year, like, why is our employment churn so high? Why did so many people quietly quit? Why is there so much frustration, angst, anxiety?
Yeah, sure.
This fascinating stuff.
All right, well, there's that sound. It's time for our fun questions. Are you ready for our fun questions?
I'm ready. I'm ready, Stacy.
All right. The first question is, what's the most unusual hobby you've ever tried or would like to try?
Okay. So this is, don't laugh. My wife and I decided when we got married, we would not have pets. And our kids will probably always be in grudge to us over this one. However, I love dogs. So I'll never own one, but I love them. I just love them. So a hobby I do is I actually go to dog parks when I have some free time, and I just watch dogs go hog wild. And it's random, but it's a great hobby of mine, and I love it.
No, that's awesome. Like, I guess that's one way, right? So if you make a decision, and what's another way that you can do it? So I love that.
Yeah.
And the best part is when you're ready to go home, you can just go home.
No hair, no dog poop.
That's right. That's right.
So it's pretty.
No vet bills.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
For sure. Love it. That's great. That is definitely probably a unique one we may never hear again, but I like it.
Okay.
That's what this is all about. All right. So a little bit along that line. Second question is, what is one of your favorite traditions?
Yeah. One of my favorite traditions, and it's, every morning, most mornings, is coffee and the Bible. It's one of my faves. Good, 3 shots of espresso and the Bible for 30, 45 minutes is one of my faves, my favorite traditions.
That is wonderful. It's so important to set your day up for success, and finding that thing that works for you is so important. So that's wonderful. I love it. I love it.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Great. Well, Garrett, thank you so much. I think you brought some great nuggets in for our listeners. I love the thought around management vertigo and how to find your way out of it. First, identify, then find your way out of it, and then also the accountability piece. Thank you for sharing your story and how you yourself was in this position and how you found your way out of it. I know that helps our listeners so they feel that they are not alone and there's part of it. So really appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, it's my privilege, Stacy. Thank you for having me on your show.
If you enjoyed the show, please go to leadershipmomentspodcast.com to subscribe to the podcast or on your favorite player, as well as follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
You can also send us a message on what you like and don't like, or what guest you want us to have on the show.
So until next time,
this is Stacy Castor, and what doesn't challenge you won't change you.
And I'm Tracy Ann Palmer. Be the change you wish to see in the world.